William Nash, Raymond Babbitt. I looked at it, looked towards my notes. Einstein, Alan Turing, Sir Isaac Newton. What do they all have in common? They all were neurodiverse people. And yet, in the UK, right now, as we speak, 1 in 5 or people with autism are employed, 4 of them are not. The prisons are absolutely overloaded with people with neurodiversity. And yet, some of our greatest geniuses have neurodiversity. So, in this episode of the Haroon Rabbani podcast, I've got a very special guest, and we're going to explore exactly how you can address your neurodiverse condition so that you can actually shine and not shy away. There's way too many people out there who are absolutely afraid of that condition. And in fact, we need to change the paradigm completely altogether. So without further ado, let me bring in Dr. Ali. I'm going to call him Ali from now. Dr. Ali Ajaz. He is a brain specialist, a psychiatrist, but I'm going to ask him a few more questions about his background. Welcome, Ali. Great to have you on board.
Thank you, Haroon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So tell us a bit about your interest in the whole neurodiverse area. And before you even do that, let's go back a bit of authority and credibility that you've got as a doctor, please.
Sure thing. So I'm a medically trained doctor. I studied at King's College, London, probably over 20 years ago now as a medical student. And after my graduation, I went straight into psychiatry. So I became a consultant forensic psychiatrist, so a specialist in forensic mental health at the East London Trust, NHS, for a good 5, 6 years, until a few years ago when I left the NHS and started working my own brain health clinic.
So let's talk about why you're focusing primarily on brain health now.
So for me, brain health makes the most sense. So if we really want to make a difference to people's health and mental health in particular, it's really important to understand the brain more than actually what we're taught as doctors in medical school. So understanding it in the way that the things that it needs to work well and to thrive, and perhaps help it get rid of the things that it doesn't need or that are quite harmful, that actually stop it from working optimally. And I think mental illness probably needs to be reframed and rephrased into brain health, because that's really where all the solutions lie, rather than having an illness where we perhaps deal with some of the symptoms with medications, but it's really just putting a plaster over it.
For the longest time, most of my life, I thought there was something wrong with me, or maybe not as a victim, but I knew I was different. And it was only earlier this year, actually, it's only about 7-8 months ago, I discovered that actually I have got so many of those symptoms of ADHD. And one of the people I was following is you, particularly on TikTok, because you do a lot of videos on there talking about various aspects of ADHD, autism, and so on. And it was this very deep, cathartic period, because for the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks, I went through a lot of internal grieving, because it explained so many things that were going so-called wrong in my life, meaning relationships and why I was thinking differently. And for the longest time, I felt really, really alone, isolated from everybody. So let's demystify. I don't know if we can do all of the neurodiverse conditions, but let's demystify autism, demystify ADHD. What are the 5 things that people need to be aware of, particularly if they're adults in the workplace or in business, who want to really transform the next 12 months ahead?
So thank you, Haroon. So the first thing I would say, that we're not dealing with illness. So neurodiversity, things like autism, dyspraxia, things like ADHD, it's not an illness. It's not an illness that needs to be cured or gotten rid of or gotten on top of. So that's the first thing. So unlike depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, these are illnesses that need specific treatment approach. Now, the problem is that we as psychiatrists are trained in only one way to deal with mental health problems. And we consider autism and ADHD and the whole range of neurodiverse issues with the same brush. It's the same brush that we use to treat illness. So that's the very first thing. We are dealing with people who have, I would consider it more a disorder, where there's an imbalance. So there's some things that neurodiverse people are just really amazing at, but there's an imbalance in their life that often the other things, the more routine or the mundane things in their life, are a lot more chaotic. So there's an imbalance. And my approach really is looking at trying to readdress that balance in their life. So keeping those things that they're really amazing at, whilst also trying to reduce the chaos in their lives. And in order to do that, it comes back down to brain health, because really what's happening outside is a reflection of actually what's happening inside. And there's an imbalance and a disorder in how their brain is working.
Mm.
So really that's how I see neurodiversity, and that's how I see the approach to it. And it just has to be different to what mainstream psychiatrists, and I've been a mainstream psychiatrist, taught in the mainstream conventional way of approaching mental illness, and it just doesn't quite fit.
So, so that's a key distinction then, which is there's nothing wrong with you. It's just you're different rather than you're sick, as opposed to depression and anxiety and so on. So that's one important area. Now, does that mean that this disorder, does that have to be a disability, or some people like myself who believe actually there's a superhero side? Is there a disability, or is it potentially an advantage?
Well, I would say both, because no one condition or no one disorder is the same across the board.
Hmm.
So I work with a lot of neurodiverse people, and some people are really quite disabled by their symptoms, to a point where they can't really function well in life. They can't hold down a job. They can't hold down relationships. They can't even hold down their own emotions. And it's interesting what you said about prison. I agree. A lot of prison populations have neurodiverse people in because they just can't cope with life, and then just end up getting into trouble because they can't manage their own emotions. So that you got one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, many of my patients have been professors, people who've owned their own businesses, people that are thriving in their lives. But ADHD, autism has got nothing to do with your intellect. So we can see on one hand people are thriving, but also struggling on the same token. And really, it's a kind of suffering in silence, because on the surface of it, you may have a great job, a great title, maybe that family, the car, but really things are quite chaotic, and people can't often understand why someone who on the outside is so successful may on the inside be really struggling.
Can you develop ADHD, autism later on in life, or is this something that you're born with?
By their very definition, they're considered to be neurodiverse disorders. Um, it's it affects the neurodevelopment. So it has to be something that, as you're growing, as your brain is developing, there are certain things that stop the brain from developing in typical ways. So we know that ADHD, autism brains, they have certain parts of brain structures that are smaller than people who are not neurodiverse. Their frontal cortex, that helps us making those executive decisions, that higher level functioning, they're less developed. Now, in some people, as they get older, the frontal cortex kind of grows up to a point that matches their non-neurodiverse peers. So some kids, adolescents, you can see kind of grow out of neurodiversity, ADHD in particular, less so with autism, but it's not something you can get as an adult. There always has to be some clues during childhood, adolescence.
Wow, I mean, it's just phenomenal. The whole thing of, for example, I actually got interviewed earlier this year, so nearly 12 months ago, about how I've achieved success both in martial arts, in sales, and so on. And the whole topic was hyper focus. Now, at that point, I did not realize that hyper focus was one of the side effects of having ADHD. Because as I want to give you a real life example. So, with all given put aside leadership and work, etc., for a moment, as an example, a few years ago, I acquired a couple of allotments, and I thought I want to go organic. I don't 100% trust what's out there, even when they call it organic, because they still put pesticides and herbicides and so on. So I want to grow my own stuff. But how do I create the soil conditions? So I must have watched hundreds of hours of how to create compost from wood chip, from manure, etc., etc. When I say hundreds, that's probably an underestimation. But it took me a year or so, but before you knew it, I learned how to produce compost, which takes a week. Yeah, absolutely mind blowing and producing amazing results. So the point is that there's that aspect, but and I can't speak on behalf of any other condition, of course. There's that aspect that I thought, okay, I'm good at that. It's just a natural thing. But I find a lot of people, especially with ADHD, for example, don't recognize how amazing they are because it's just something that they used to on a day-to-day basis. So what are the what are the main barriers that are people are facing when they discover, or maybe they've not even discovered that they're ADHD? What are the main issues? I mean, what one is distraction. We know that. What else?
So it's really an allocation of attention. So if we're talking about a disability, it's really a disability of being able to allocate attention to a task at the right time when it's required. So it's easy if it's something that interests you. You could do that all day long, all day, all night long, 7 days a week. But when it comes to the mundane things in life, like paying bills, like organizing your family, organizing holidays, um, getting your homework done, getting that piece of work done for your employer, holding yourself to these deadlines, that's where the challenge is. So it's that shifting from attention. So it's not necessarily a deficit in attention, and that's where the name ADHD perhaps is not doing people much service. So it's really a problem shifting attention rather than attention per se, and that's one of the biggest barriers. And alongside that, there's a whole range of uh, inattention, distractibility, difficulty regulating someone's emotions, being more impulsive, and often it's impulsive at things that are just adding more toil to the brain, things that are not helping. Often food, often pursuits that are probably a bit risky, but all that feeds into trying to get the brain to work at a certain level. So all these things make sense on a physiological level, but when it comes to translating these things, there's a whole range of barriers that people with ADHD in particular face.
One of my greatest struggles, without a shadow of a doubt, back in when I used to sell medical equipment, was I was one of the top performers in my first company, and my second company that I worked for, I was the number one performer in generating sales. I'm talking about exponentially ahead of the game with everyone. But the thing I hated, like, hated with a passion, was the admin side. Was the side where they asked us to sit down and analyze all the figures coming in, all the figures that might potentially come in. It, I kid you not, it used to cause so much anxiety for me. And actually, part of the reason I left that company was that particular issue. Is that quite common? Is it?
I see that as a very common thing, and people often, if they're able to, they end up working for themselves rather than employers. They find it just too difficult having those constrictions around them. So many people that I see with ADHD have their own companies. It just varies across the board. But if you're working for yourself, you can maybe delegate some of the paperwork, or often let it build up, and then you get into panic, and then you kind of get it done at the last minute. But there's not that external pressure. So
Mm.
it's certainly a phenomenon that I see, and in the workspace, it's a big problem because there are some people who can't go and work for themselves, so they're stuck in positions where they're performing subpar, and really struggling and taking work home and just not being able to relax. And there's pressures of performance reviews, and the same themes keep coming up and up, and they feel as though they're just stuck in this whirlwind. And it is very difficult for a lot of people out there.
So when when someone is that kind of in that kind of condition, and they haven't got that choice of going out and just starting their own business, is there any help they can get besides, well, yeah, if they're working for somebody else, is there anything that they can do for themselves within the organization that will help their cause?
So usually there are a range of employee assistant programs out there, and I guess the bigger the company, the bigger the options you have within that. So I think that would be a starting point for everyone, and that can range from meeting with someone that you can do some talking therapy with, or a nutritionist, or someone who can help with stress management, yoga, meditation. These kinds of things can be really effective just to manage that stress in that moment, to allow you to calm things down in order to try and make some progress or some headway. So for some people, those strategies are very, very effective. Other employee assistance programs are connected to medical professionals and can really channel people through to get more formal assessments if that's something that comes up.
So a friend of mine who is a professional speaker, goes into schools and speaks. He has autism, it's quite bad. In fact, most of his life, he couldn't work for anybody at all. Despite falling apart when it comes to working for somebody, following instructions, this is the same man who's completed, I can't remember the exact figures, but 73 or 71 triathlons in about 75 days. I can't. He actually holds a world's Guinness Book of World Record on that.
Wow.
How do you take someone who's off the scale successful in one area, but they cannot handle just day to day normal living?
Very simple. It's all about dopamine. So when you have those extreme sports as the example, the extremity of it is a thing that's exciting. It's a thing that's stimulating, and it's a thing that gives you that dopamine boost. And so I've seen many people that I've assessed that end up doing Ironman competitions or a number of marathons, 2, 3 a month, just that high level intensity, and it is superhuman. But what drives someone to do that? It's all about their brain. Going to those lengths for some people is a level of stimulation that they need to release dopamine enough for them to feel normal. And anything else, and the more mundane things in life, just don't cut the mustard, just don't reach the threshold for that level of stimulation.
So the same friend, by the way, he works in an aquarium center, does about 10 hours a week, as a job. They don't pay much, but you know what he looks after? 9-foot sharks. That's his mundane day-to-day job. I mean, the guy's, like I said, such a genius on so many levels, but just the very bare basic things he's struggling with. So there's a lot of topics we're covering here, but I think it'll be. I will splice these videos up because it's very important that we do and share it as much as possible. This is so relevant to the people in the workspace, as well as people who are employers as well, and self-employed people. So there's one area that I'm a bit confused about, because statistically, according to all my Google search, of course, statistically, apparently men have exponentially um, more neurodiverse conditions than women. But what is your experience with women with, I don't know, ADHD and autism, particularly later on in life?
But I think that disparity, in reality, is more equal to a 1-to-1 ratio, rather than the imbalance we've got. And the main reason for this is that the diagnostic criteria are biased really against women. So they pick up traits that are more common in men. So ADHD, for example, the hyperactivity, impulsivity, is something you see a lot more in men, but less so in women. And we didn't really think that women had ADHD because they didn't have that impulsive side to things. But we understand that ADHD is more than just one thing. So a lot of women are walking around with ADHD, are neurodiverse, and it's just been missed. And the problem is that their struggle in life is a lot more than it should be. And they often get gaslit and get told just to carry on because they're much better at coping. Women are much, much more better at masking and coping, although it takes a lot out of them. But on the surface of it, things may seem fine. So it's really a failure, I would say, of medicine that we've used certain criteria to overlook the struggles of women and how neurodiversity manifests in women.
What about women who are going through menopause? How does it affect them? Because that's a bit of a testing period, to say the least.
Well, I always say to my female clients that females are a lot more sophisticated in their physiology, because their hormone system is far more complex than men. So men, we have mainly testosterone, which increases up to the age of about 20, mid-20s. It stays pretty stable for about another 20 years and then slowly declines, and that's your story. But for females, they've got a more complex interplay between estrogen and progesterone that has a monthly cycle, but then also it has a cycle that over, well, by middle age, it starts to decline. And these hormones are really important because, as well as being sex hormones, they're also brain hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, they all have many receptors in the brain. So it's really a double whammy as a female, that not only is the diagnostic criteria against you in many ways, you're overlooked. You also suffer more because your hormones are something that really don't do you any favors when it comes to ADHD.
When it comes to diagnosis, of course, I've heard that. I keep scratching my head like there because I'm like, it's almost like frustrating. We need to get this out there more. Women, I've heard, take maybe 6 to 10 visits to a doctor before they even diagnose with menopause, let alone with ADHD. So let's tap into one particular area. And again, we're covering a huge topic area. We'll come back and perhaps do individual topics in the future. But one particular area is parents who've got children with ADHD. Now, it's a disorder, but it doesn't have to be a disability. And yes, there's a spectrum. So, my best friend David, his son is severely autistic, and they need external help, etc. But mild to moderate, whether it be ADHD, autism, if how do they spot the signs to start off with? And secondly, parents, what can they do to perhaps create more balance, harmony in their home in terms of raising their children?
So you're asking about parents spotting the signs in their children. Well, it's interesting. There's usually some type of disruption. There's a sense that the child is excessive in some way, whether it's through their behavior, whether they're a bit too intense, whether they don't calm down enough, whether they throw too many temper tantrums, or whether it's getting reports from school that actually they're not doing as well as their peers. They're maybe a bit more distracted, or they're like the class clown and they play up and they're just naughty, and some downright aggressive and oppositional against teachers and authority. So there's a sense that there's an excessiveness, and that's a really core feature, this excessiveness, because we all have aspects of ADHD, autism in us. What happens is that they get taken to more of an extreme where they start becoming problematic. So it's this sense of parents seeing that something is not right, and especially if you've got more than one child, you're able to kind of compare and see, well, actually, something's not right with Johnny. What's wrong? I know something's not right. And so either from the home or from school, things get picked up, and whether it's persistent themes in school reports, that's often a common thing, that you just need to try harder, and then they would be a lot more successful, or they're just too distracted, or they just need to be better behaved in order to make a lot more progress.
I often speak, when I say I often, quite frequently speak at schools, motivational talks and so on. I've led workshops at schools, teenage in particular, for the last 21, 22 years. One of the common themes that I see is there's always a small cohort of primarily men, young adults, males and females as well, actually, at times, where they got major behavioral issues. And when I get a chance to speak to them privately, out of the couple of hundred students that might be there, and I ask them questions, I think, blow me, this child is a genius. They're in an environment that just isn't suited for them. So what can parents do, rather than think of it as a burden? Because there's no two people who are the exact same, right? We know that. But then you got a child whose behavior they're just simply bored because they're like, yeah, move on. But the school obviously will only work on the law of averages and perhaps work with the weakest more than the ones who are genius levels. Is there anything that parents or even teachers can do in a general comprehensive setting where they can help the young people, or help them, the teachers help themselves, the parents help themselves?
Well, the first thing is not to compare the child with either a sibling or other kids in the class. That so and so is like this. We just a bit more like Ruth over there or Johnny over there, then everything will be fine. Because that's the most damaging thing. That from an early age, children who are neurodiverse, they know there's something different, but then what they hear from the external sources, adults, teachers, is that they're just essentially not good enough. And that's the most damaging thing, the number one damaging thing for a child to hear, because that stays with them, that imprints on their mind, their psyche. And as adults, even though they may be thriving, that voice is still playing there, that they're just not good enough. So that's the first thing. Don't compare. Don't compare with any other children. And it's really, it might be nurturing the child's brain. And how do we do this? Well, the first thing is cutting out the things that are harmful. So food is the best medicine of them all, but it can also be the most toxic thing. So looking at what children are being fed and are eating, and I'm a big fan of cutting out sugar, cutting out processed foods, artificial preservatives, because these things actually have been shown in the scientific research to help children with ADHD, to help with focus, to help with concentration. They're actually toxic things for the brain, and they just stop it from working and developing. So you've got to cut out the rubbish. You've got to add in things that are helpful. So you replace the foods with low simple carb, high protein foods, things that are really going to help and support the brain. Supplements are really important as well. I think children and adults with ADHD should be on a foundational level of a supplement regime, including high dose multivitamin, omega-3 fatty acids, and a probiotic. And I think that's a staple for everyone. And then just encourage them to move and channel their energies into something like exercise. We know exercise is one of the best treatments for ADHD. So it's really trying to embrace not only their strengths, but also to support their brain in order for them to level up when it comes to some of the things that they're struggling with.
And that's a good point you mentioned about exercise, because recently of late, I've been going to the gym quite very regularly, very, very regularly. And I kid you not, I am so much more at peace, so little anxiety and stress compared to normal. So, I mean, that could be just me, but how, let's go
Oh,
dive deeper into exercise. What kind of exercise? How long? How frequent?
yeah. So it's clear in the scientific research that exercise improves ADHD symptoms, and I've seen it in my own clinical practice. I work with a lot of neurodiverse people, and as well as medication options, there's really the non-medication lifestyle, brain health, investing in yourself, and exercise is always a key part of that. So for ADHD in particular, we're really looking at 30 to 45 minutes of moderate to high intensity exercise 3 to 4 times a week. And that's really the minimum. Walking is good, right? Walking is fine, but it doesn't reach that threshold. So it has to be a specific level of exercise. Ideally, if you can incorporate it into a daily routine, that's ideal. But really, that's what we're looking at. And when people are able to do that over the research in a couple of weeks, you start to notice the difference. It may not be the first time or the second time, but within a couple of weeks, you start to notice a difference. And the reliance on that, when you stop doing it, things generally feel worse. And we know exercise really helps boost that dopamine. It's a natural way of getting dopamine more effective, more available, and for you to feel calmer and more at ease with yourself.
From the age of 14 through to the age of, I don't know, way beyond 18, but certainly 18, I used to train in martial arts 7 days a week. I kid you not, I never had any stress, no anxiety. I had stressful stuff going on.
Mhm.
Believe you me, I had a lot racism, all sorts of stuff to deal with, violence and so on. But I was never stressed or anxious. It is absolutely mind blowing, and again, this is Ali. This is so important to hear this. Certainly, if nobody else, at least for me, because it's reassuring that you're not weird, and it's reassuring also to not like I am some kind of superhero. I have superhero powers, but not some kind of superhero where I have to save everybody. So that's particularly important. Now, what about the role of medication for people with ADHD. We'll focus on ADHD. We'll have to do a separate one purely on autism. But medication and ADHD, should it be taken? If so, what? If so, how? And so on.
So medication can potentially be really helpful for lots of people. And I've seen when it comes to the range of psychotropic medications or medications that psychiatrists prescribe for mental health problems, it's probably one of the most effective out there. It does more what it says more often than any other medication that I've seen. So that's a plus point. If you're on medication, it's likely it's going to work and it's going to help. And I'd say about 80% of people benefit from being on medication. And that's really benefiting from the core symptoms of ADHD, like focus, attention, concentration, being able to calm those thoughts down, having ultimately better sleep and better relationships and work success. So I've seen it really change people's lives around in a matter of days or weeks, really. So it has that potential to be really effective. Now, like most medication, though, it doesn't address any of the root causes or any of the problems that might be going on inside the brain. So as a short-term measure, I think it can be highly effective. For children, I wouldn't often consider it as the first choice because, as we've mentioned, there's a whole range of lifestyle factors that always come first and can make a big difference. But in adults, often I find that adults like to go on medication first because life, as you were saying, it's stressful. You've got so many things on, and to incorporate new routines is too much of a push for many people. So medication in the short term can really help people build those routines, build those habits, control those impulses, and then over the longer term can come down in terms of the dosage and ultimately come off and be less reliant. And I've seen people who are able to invest in their brain health whilst on medication become a lot less reliant on those who just take medication by itself. So that's what's possible. But I think ultimately it's a person's choice and having informed consent that actually take these medications in the short term, it can give you a lot of benefit. In the longer term, there are unknown risks, but it's your choice. And as doctors, it's about giving informed choice to your patients and really just working with them in terms of how they want to move forward.
As a psychiatrist, do you also work directly with people's GPs, so they're physicians for our American audience?
Yes, so that's really important. So once someone is established on ADHD medication, I write to the GP and update them with a diagnosis and update them with a treatment plan and ask them to really start to carry on prescribing the medication under the NHS, our National Health Service here, that takes a financial burden off people having to pay medication for themselves, but then also being able to monitor the medication because it does need specialist monitoring every 6 months or so.
So one of the biggest concerns in the UK, particularly in context of the program that I have, Harun Rabbani podcast, which is all about self-leadership and leading others. So one of the biggest issues is we've got an economy in many respects in a decline. We've got a very difficult conditions regarding the general public, energy crisis, and so on. As employers, so I know you work with corporations, with businesses. As employers, what are the steps they can take to help the employees who may have one of the neurodiverse conditions? To help them, well, first of all, improve their productivity, performance, even turning up to work, because obviously many side issues or side effects of having any of these conditions, for example, is anxiety and stress, which means your productivity falls down. So what can company leaders do, what can employers do to help create a more level playing field for these geniuses in hiding?
So the first thing is really to embrace their strengths. And I can't understate this enough. If you're a leader and you have a team and you've got some neurodiverse employees there as part of your team, what you really want to do is find out, what they're thriving with and encourage that and reinforce that. And on the same token, look at those areas that they're struggling with and try and work with them to develop a specific plan for them. And things that it have to be revolutionary things, where it might be how to deal with perhaps certain anxieties with perhaps being late all the time or being a bit late with deadlines instead of just meetings, and really taking the pressure off your employee to say, look, it's okay, we understand, it's not going to be the end of the world, but it's coming to a point where you're giving them enough reassurance without compromising on your business, because clearly you need people to be performing at a level, but then also to be able to encouraging the strengths that they have. And if you've got someone who's holding down a job with ADHD, it's inevitable that there are things that they're really, really good at. And that's always my first point. Going to encourage and understand and make it a much safer place for them to work. And when people feel safer at work, then that's a real platform for them to thrive and make progress.
I'm self-employed and I have been since 2003, 2002. I set up my own company up. And I can tell you what, I can write an entire book on how not to treat a person with ADHD. To micromanage, for example. Don't micromanage someone with ADHD. It doesn't work. The whole deadline thing, whatever the deadline is, it's going to be lastminute.com. Just keep that in mind. So don't have a deadline months, weeks in advance. Make sure they're shorter deadlines. They'll get it done. There's so much we can say what not to do, but I would love to see in the next 12 months, maybe even less than that, businesses who are serious about their employees, because they are your greatest asset. Yes, we're going to have AI coming in and taking over and forcing people out of work, but in the meantime, you still got to have humans to operate these systems. So I would love for, certainly within the UK, because that's where we're based, I would love for within the UK for companies to develop. The one thing I have to say is missing, obviously missing, is compassion towards the people who are working for you. I mean, think about it. If you're working 8 hours a day, and a lot of leaders work more, but if you're working 8 hours a day, you're going to spend an hour and a half, 2 hours getting ready to go to work. And then you got to go back home. So in essence, you're giving 10, 12 hours of your waking day just to the job 5 days a week. Why would you not want your employees to enjoy that? Why would you not want them to be fulfilled? Why do you want to let your staff go so that you spend tens of thousands recruiting more people? So as we start wrapping up, I'd love for our listeners, our viewers who believe they have neurodiverse conditions, maybe a few habits, maybe a few behaviors they can develop, maybe a few rituals that they can develop to help over the longer period of time. For example, for me, meditation is amazing, going to the gym. What would you suggest are habits that people can incorporate?
So there's lots of habits. Let's see what resonates with the viewers. So the first thing is cutting out things that are really just harmful for your brain and exacerbating the problems that you have. So cut out all sugar, all refined processed sugar, anything with sugar in the title. Cut out processed foods, cut out alcohol. These things aren't doing you any favors. And when you're free of those, your brain starts to clear up. That brain fog starts to lift, and everything starts to get better. So that's really key around your food and your diet. Replacing foods with high protein, the cleanest protein that you can find. High protein, I would look at starting off at 1 gram per kilogram body weight of protein per day, and really kind of boost that protein that we know that helps balance sugar levels, and it helps us focus and concentrate and work on a much better level. Sleep is really important, and that's one of the things that people with ADHD struggle with. So I guess alongside that, hand in hand, comes a meditation and relaxation strategies that you try and develop into a pre-sleep routine. So an hour or so before going to bed, try and unwind, whether that's with the lights down, with some light music, nothing overly stimulating. Off screens, TVs, the blue light from those are really alerting for the mind, and often it can be quite difficult for people with ADHD to start this, but once you get into it, you can get a lot of benefits. So being able to relax, and then that affecting your sleep and having better quality sleep. So we're looking at 6 to 7 minimum hours of good quality sleep at night, and incorporating that exercise. I think it's essential. These things are foundational investments in your brain health. And what I find is when people are able to invest in their brain health, there's only one outcome, and the outcome is success.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I wish you where were you 40? Oh yeah, you're younger than me. You were 40 years ago, you would have been a little kid. So brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant. Is there a question that I perhaps, if you were sitting in my shoes, that I should have asked that I haven't asked? Is there anything that I've missed out for the time being?
I think you covered the main areas really. I think the I guess the other thing is the stigma, which is alive and kicking in mental health, and it's double-edged when it comes to neurodiversity and ADHD in particular. So on one hand, lots of people are talking about it, and lots of people are being diagnosed with it. And yes, there might be some overdiagnosis, but it's really tipped things the other way, that people are saying, well, oh, there's another one with ADHD or there's another one with autism, that actually, rather than no one talking about it, it's talked to excess to a point where people are looking down and saying, well, you know, you just want an easy life, or you just want to blame something else, and really doubting. It goes back to those core stigmas when it comes to mental health, mental illness, anything to do with the mind. And I think that's alive and kicking. So people having the courage and the knowledge to be able to challenge those things, I think, is really important. And the workplace is a key part for that, but also people's personal lives, family members, friends. So that is a really important aspect, which hopefully we can touch more again at another time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I saw a report by Harvard Business Review, and they said that in corporate teams where they've got neurodiverse people of different backgrounds, the productivity rate increases by 30%. So the level of assets is off the scale. And just think, the names that I mentioned that I referred to at the beginning, at the top of the show, Raymond Babbitt is the character played by Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man. And I saw that when it first came out, I don't know, 40 years ago approximately, and I was absolutely blown away. What typically, when you don't know, you see this person as a disabled person, and you start exploring this kind of area of neurodiversity, you discover that we are actually with geniuses, the greatest scientific discoveries. I mean, come on, Sir Isaac Newton. I can't remember. I think he was autistic. Einstein, I think he may have been autistic as well. So we are leaving so much talent hidden away because we haven't developed compassion yet. And I would love to continue this conversation with you, Ali, going forth, maybe once a month or something. And for listeners, for viewers, thank you so much for listening and chiming in. If you have, connect with Dr. Ali Ajaz. Well, what's the best way to connect with you, actually? Well, where would people find you?
So I'm on the common social media platforms. I'm on LinkedIn. I do a lot of TikTok posts, Instagram as well. I have a website, draliajaz.co.uk. You can drop me a message from there.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And I will see you very soon on another episode of Haroon Rabbani Podcast. Bye for now.